So I received a comment. I'm going to see if I can like photo or screenshot it and post it up there about sizing in the Victorian era. The comment said that it was on my duster coat video, and the comment said that it seems as though a lot of clothing from the Victorian era is significantly smaller than people tend to be nowadays. So I was wondering, the person who typed it was wondering how common it was to find pieces of clothing that can fit me. And I am quite large. I am 6'1". I'm 6'1". I come from a very tall family. My uncle is 6'8". Yeah, I'm 6'1" and relatively big boned. So is it difficult to find clothes that fit, antique clothes that fit me, and is it difficult to find antique clothes that fit the average height, the average sized person, or we're going to say woman, in 2019 now. Now, to start off, I am not of an average height. As I've already mentioned, I'm very tall. But I can find antique clothing that fits me. And if I were a bit shorter and a bit more compact, I would be able to find even more antique clothing that fit me. There's a stereotype, I think, that people in the past were much smaller than we are. And to a certain extent that is true. Average height has risen a little bit by a few centimeters, but it's not as true as you might think. I mean, there's this kind of idea that everybody in the Victorian era was 4 or 5 feet tall. That's not true, and it hasn't been true for a long time. Mary Queen of Scots, who lived in the 1500s, so significantly before the Victorian era, she was, accounts say, between 5'11" and 6'1". That would have been uncommon, but it certainly wasn't impossible. Henry VIII was, I believe, 5'3", or maybe even 5'5", I can't remember. So there were tall people in the 1800s, and there were also, people came in all shapes and sizes back then, so there were plumper people, and there were thinner people in the 1800s. And I have a few examples of clothing from the Victorian era that can show, that can prove that there were indeed people, or from the Victorian and Edwardian era, I should say, that can prove that there were people of all different shapes and sizes. So we're going to start off with small. This is a sash that goes to a wedding dress from around 1895. That's the sash. Here's the skirt. And my favorite part, the bodice. Check out these sleeves. Here, I can't remotely put this on. My 10-year-old cousin could scarcely fit it, but check out these sleeves. I absolutely love those. This is absolutely tiny. I have a measuring tape here, and we're going to measure this sash. I am a dumb American, so the measurement will be in inches. So this sash is 23.5 inches. So this is quite small. And not only is the waist small, but the entire thing is small. As I mentioned, my 10-year-old cousin could barely fit in that. Of course, her father is 6'8", so for a 10-year-old she is quite big. But still, that is a very, very small dress. And it was meant to be worn by an adult woman, anywhere between 18 and, 35, depending on when she was getting married. But it's tiny. Another example of a tiny piece of clothing from the Victorian era is this bodice. This dates from the mid-1880s, and I don't have it all buttoned up. I don't know why. This is I absolutely adore this bodice. Let's see if I can get a close-up on these buttons. Aren't those pretty? And this, there would have originally been another one of these matching over here, and then this bit of chain would have kind of connected there. At some point, either when it was originally made or a bit later, these bits of these jet spangles here were added. They're kind of falling apart. And it's also got these cute little tails, and this would have sat kind of out like that over the bustle. This is second bustle era. And I also just love the velvet lapel, and ooh, I kicked my chair. And it's all edged in this this beaded lace. Oh, and also the cuffs. I absolutely adore these cuffs with this such pretty lace. I just think they're so interesting. So I absolutely love this bodice, and it is another absolutely tiny piece of clothing. You probably would have originally had a matching skirt as well, but this is absolutely tiny. So yeah, this is another piece of clothing that is absolutely tiny, and you know, it's the kind of thing when if you were to just look at the measurements, you would think that it was made for a child, but it wasn't. It was made for an adult woman, and just for fun, I'm gonna unbutton it, and we're gonna measure the waist stay. Oh, one more button. A lot of Victorian and Edwardian bodices will have one of these, and this is something that you would fasten around your waist, and this just kind of kept the bodice from moving around too much, and it would just kind of keep it in place. So this bodice is 20 inches around the waist. So, and also it's just very scaled down. But again, this is made for an adult woman, a fully grown woman. So this was made for a woman who is very small. Now I want to show you some other pieces of clothing. This is a bodice. It's not in the best shape, but this is a bodice from around 1910 to 1914. It's got this beautiful beading here and this beading here as well, this lace around the collar. This, unfortunately, the silk up here is just completely falling apart. And then the sleeves are this lovely sort of translucent fabric, and then they've got the silk and beading again on the cuffs. This square neckline is very, very indicative of the 1910s, pre-war 1910s. Now this bodice is significantly too large for me. Its waist is approximately 40 inches around the waist, and its shoulders are also quite broad, and it's meant for somebody who's quite buxom as well. So that bodice is an example of a piece of clothing that is quite large. That was for a heavy-set woman. And then there's also this skirt from first decade of the 1900s, probably around 1905 to 08. Whoops, it's got this belt that's being, there we go. It's made out of this navy blue silk, and it's got these really cool pleats here at the front, and then at the back it's got, oops, it's got this panel here that is actually sewn separately, and of course the skirt underneath it is sewn up. And it just, oh, the camera picks up the iridescence of it so nicely. And here's the bottom of the back. It's made out of silk, and then this is, the bottom is lined in some very soft wool. And then the back is just slightly gathered. And then it's got this belt around the top that has these pretty buttons. Let's see, that one doesn't come on. So this skirt fits me perfectly around the waist, and also is just about the right length for me. It is ever so slight, it's maybe half an inch too short for me, but this skirt fits me almost exactly. So this was made for a woman who was almost exactly my same measurements, maybe just about half an inch or at most an inch shorter. This probably would have had a matching bodice as well. So there you see that Victorian and Edwardian people came in all shapes and sizes. There were tiny ones, there were large ones, and then there were me-sized ones. So, why do we have this stereotype that all Victorian and Edwardian people were tiny? Well, part of that is from the surviving clothing, because in spite of the pieces that I've just shown you, surviving pieces of clothing do tend to be very, very small. It's much more common for antique clothing to be incredibly and unrealistically small. This is for several reasons. Partially, if you're talking about waist size in particular, women would tend to lace their corsets tighter for special occasions. So their ball gowns and their party dresses might have a smaller waist measurement than their normal everyday clothes, but because you don't go to balls and parties very often, the ball gowns and the party dresses are more likely to survive. Similarly with the wedding gown here, this probably survived because it had some sentimental value, and it wasn't being worn very often. Ball gowns and party gowns, even today, don't receive that much wear, so they're much more likely to last. That's also where the idea that, oh, the Victorians were wearing silks and velvets, every day. No, they weren't. That's just a majority of the surviving pieces of clothing are made out of silk and velvet because they are party dresses. They're for formal occasions. And also, they tend to have smaller waists because, again, they were for formal, fancy occasions. Everyday clothing, by contrast, tended to... you wouldn't lace your corset as tightly for an everyday event, because why would you? You need to function, you need to live, you need to perform your tasks. So it wouldn't make sense to crank your waist down to 20 inches. Also, there is the question of survival bias. Oh yeah, speaking of formal, this is made out of silk and velvet and it's covered in this jet beading. This was definitely a piece of formal clothing. This is not something that you'd wear on a day-to-day basis. There's also the issue of survival bias. Now, if something is serviceable, then it's probably going to be worn. It isn't the case so much now as it was then, since it's easier to get clothing now, but back in the 1800s, if you had a piece of clothing that fit you, then you were going to wear it, because it was difficult to make. It was difficult to come by new clothes. So most of the clothing that, and then of course, if you inherited a piece of clothing that would fit you, you would wear that until it was worn out. So a lot of the clothing that survives is clothing that actually didn't fit very many people, because nobody could fit into it, so nobody was wearing it, so therefore it survived. The clothing that was sized for normal people, that was of an average, made for an average body type, has mostly been worn out. A similar thing happened with shoes. I actually have a pair that I believe were shown in one of my videos. Where are they? Aha. These. Now these are quite small. And then again, my feet are quite large, so to me most shoes look small. These are quite small, but so that could lead one to believe that, all of the Victorians and Edwardians had tiny feet. But the fact that they survive actually leads us to the opposite conclusion, that they had feet that were roughly the same size as ours, and that they used all of the shoes that they could use. And that because these survived, that means that they weren't really being worn. That, because people couldn't fit into them. And also, any shoes that did survive the Victorian era then made it into the Great Depression. And during the Great Depression, when money was scarce, you would not necessarily insist upon wearing fashionable shoes. You would wear whatever you could get your hands on. So if you happen to come across a pair of 30-year-old Victorian boots, you'd probably wear those out. So not only were most of the Victorian shoes worn out in the Victorian era, whatever did survive, most of what survived were worn out later on. Same thing kind of goes for the clothing, but it's kind of difficult to... I mean, shoes, you just have to get them to fit. Clothing has to fit here, it has to fit here, here, here. So it's much more unlikely that anybody in the 1930s would be able to find a full Victorian ensemble. It would probably be easier at that point to just buy some cheap fabric and make yourself a dress. So that's where we get this idea that Victorians and Edwardians were very small. Is A, because of evening clothing surviving in greater quantity, and also because of survival bias. I feel like I did a really bad job of explaining this. I feel like I just was talking in circles and saying nothing. But, yeah, I'm going to try to sum it up one more time. Clothing that was of an adequate size to be worn was worn until it was worn out. Whereas clothing that was too small to be worn wasn't worn, and that's why it survives. And that's where we get this idea that the Victorians were tiny. I hope that cleared some things up. If you still have any questions, if this wasn't clear, if I sounded as garbled as I think I did, then please let me know in the comments and I'll try to explain everything. Also, I hope you can excuse my voice. I know that right now I do sound like Lucille Ball about 2 months before she died. I have a very bad cold right now. I'm on the mend. I'm on the mend, but for the last 2 days I've been stuck in bed. That was not fun. I did get to page 70 of The Scarlet Letter, though, so something I've been meaning to read for about 5 years. For some reason I didn't have to read it in high school. So, I hope you enjoyed that video. I'm going to try to make at least one more video before I go to Denmark. I'm going on the 11th. And then what I might do is try to make a few videos and then release them slowly when I'm in Denmark. Just while I'm settling in, I'm probably not going to want to make videos, so that I might be able to, when I have free time, I'm going to try to make some videos and then release them maybe once every 2 weeks for a month or so while I'm getting used to Denmark. No promises. I found that that's a very bad thing for me to do, is promise things. But I am going to try to do that. So I really hope you enjoyed this video. I hope that it wasn't as addled as I think it is. And I will see you again soon. Bye-bye.